So my name is Mona Sheth. I am a lead lobbyist with the Schneider Electric Government Relations team. For the past decade, I have been based in Washington, D.C. as our chief federal lobbyist. I've recently relocated to the Southeast to follow the infrastructure dollars and see how they're going to be implemented at the state and local level. And as Maury said, we're collaborating a lot together. So we are working with the Aviva Strategy and Government Relations team to further promote this message around digitization. And if we're going to spend all this money, we better make next generation infrastructure in this country. So today I'm going to do a little bit 101 and dive into what's in the infrastructure package. Hopefully you'll leave feeling optimistic about how it's going to propel and fuel more of the projects that we just heard about this morning as well. So just taking us a little bit back in time, November 2021, President Biden signs the bipartisan, once-in-a-generation, $1.3 trillion infrastructure bill. Inside the bill, we have a lot of new areas that are funded that you wouldn't consider typically infrastructure, right? So in the old days, infrastructure was roads, highways, bridges, and no longer. We understand broadband, internet, electric vehicles, water, wastewater, all of these other segments of our infrastructure that all of you work in are part of the infrastructure story. So for the first time ever, we see, I'm just going to say here, you're going to see broadband deployment, $65 billion. All of a sudden, port upgrades, airport upgrades. These are areas that for a long time we really hadn't funded. We sort of used existing federal funding to just kind of keep things going along, but in this bipartisan infrastructure package, both Republicans and Democrats decided it's time for us to do something a little more interesting with our infrastructure. So thus, we have all of these other segments swept in. We have first time ever funding for electrification, widespread resiliency, as well as the digital story. And so here's just an example. Maybe you're from some of these states, but these are different governors and senators that are all kind of talking about how they're excited about the funding. States are really reliant on federal funding, especially when it comes to some of the infrastructure segments that I mentioned. And so where we are at now in 2023 is starting to see some of this funding come down the line. I'm going to just skip actually to this map right here. So these dots on the left on this map just show you kind of the coverage of funding that's gone out across the United States. And we are continuing to monitor and track some of these projects. These projects are likely going out to bid this year. So if you're like, well, I haven't seen a lot of new projects in my district or state, it's because it goes through that state procurement cycle, and so it takes a little bit of time. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this funding breaks down. So I mentioned the 1.3 trillion overall. This is really where I want to focus is the 550 billion. That's new spending. So that's above and beyond what we would just traditionally do as a country funding our infrastructure. So we have 550 billion, which is new spending, and half of that is going towards transportation, and the other half is going towards what we call core infrastructure. So if we break down transportation, you can see lots of roads, bridges, major projects here. But what I want you to pay attention to is this is the new EV infrastructure that is coming online. So President Biden has said 500,000 electric vehicle chargers in the next 5 years. That's part of this funding here. This is your airports, ports, and waterways. Airports and ports have already started to receive funding, so they're going to start bidding out those projects soon. And then there's public transit and passenger and freight rail as well. Okay, here's just another way that we're kind of breaking it down. I know it's a lot of things here, but what I wanted to point out is that after that traditional highway funding, power and grid emerged as a significant area that also is going to be heavily funded, 73 billion here. That's going to be upgrades in transmission, distribution, and some of that it does include software. Water infrastructure is 55 billion. I have to tell you, water is like the most bipartisan area of infrastructure. If you want to pass something in Congress, you should work on water because everybody knows we need it. Everybody knows that we need to upgrade it. And then I mentioned broadband as well. One of the things that Schneider Electric thinks about a lot is how do we improve our distribution side investments, right? How do we bring power closer to the consumer? And so for us, we really have pushed at both the federal and the state level, the story around the resiliency piece, right? Like in a state like California, microgrid technology and technologies that enable us to have a layer of resiliency are really important. So all of those things have been identified, and we lobbied for a lot of those things and we got them. So a lot of those things now are being funded, and we're going to see some really transformative projects. We're actually working really closely with Aviva to do some first ever federal grant work where we can tie in both the software story as well as the hardware. So we're super excited about that. Also, just as a reminder, this money is over 5-6 years. So if you're like, it sounds like a lot of money or it doesn't sound like a lot of money, just think it's got to be spent over 5-6 years. And most of this funding, it's just another kind of quick look at the funding, but most of this funding is going directly down to states and localities. Why is this important? This is important so that funding does not get tied up at the federal government, that it's actually going to be spent by state governments and localities that know what their priorities are. We call this formula funding because the funding is distributed by population. So California's getting a lot of money, Florida's getting a lot of money, New York State's getting a lot of money, but all the other states are also going to be receiving in proportion to their population this funding as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, a lot of this is transportation, so it's going to be overseen by the Department of Transportation, but the next most important federal agency is the Department of Energy. So we are working closely to have relationships with both DOT and DOE, and in a lot of our conversations with them, there's a lot of education we have to do. I mean, it's not unlike sales, where they have to understand, what does our infrastructure need to be upgraded? Why do we need software? Why do we need things like Pi? Why do we need to convince people to invest in something that maybe is a little more expensive upfront, but long-term is going to have lower OpEx issues? This is just overwhelming, so I'm going to skip it. Okay, so if anybody here is kind of involved with schools or buildings, these are a couple of the programs I've listed. I'm not going to go into detail with all of them, but maybe what I'll point out is that these are programs that are designed to bring in electric buses to schools. These are programs that have become much more expansive and flexible. So in the past, a lot of energy efficiency state funds only went towards ESCO projects and performance contracting. Now they're looking at some of these old programs and they're saying, no, we want these programs to go towards electrification. We want to make sure that, you know, if a school decides to have an electric bus, they need to upgrade their building as well, right? I mean, you have to kind of do a wholesale infrastructure upgrade. So a lot more elements to some of these programs. Maybe I'll focus in on SEP. So the SEP is a large state energy program that has gone towards facilitating energy efficiency upgrades. And what we're learning now is that they're also going to be looking at resiliency across the state and the locality. So again, looking at California as an example, their SEP fund is now going to go to support some of that resiliency needs here in the state. So what do you do in a state if you're interested in this money? If you're a municipality, if you're a school, if you're a hospital, if you're a university? Well, the first thing is that you really need to meet with your state agencies. So I highlighted state agencies because even though there's a lot of politics around, like, we want the federal money or we don't want the federal money, the money is coming. There are pre-existing channels through which the money flows through. And once it hits those channels, the state receives those dollars. So a really good example is, let's take water, right? In many states, water has two different agencies that have authority. A water department, and then sometimes an infrastructure or a loan or finance bank that is overseeing those water dollars. Those folks that are working at those agencies, they have a responsibility to write a plan, to submit that plan to the federal government, and then have approval. So in their plan, they're going to list a lot of what they believe are their priority water projects. And they're going to get a lot of that information from their municipalities and from other businesses and stakeholders that talk to them. So really, this is again about education, influence, and communication. If you believe that it's really important for a water facility to have software and digital capabilities, or if you think it's really important to have connected products, whatever it might be, this is something that should be communicated to these folks. The UC Davis story is a really good example of the type of story that you can tell a government official and they will be like all stars in their eyes to do more of that stuff, so they can have some really good press. Same with the energy department. You know, if you have a state energy department, they're going to be looking at electrification dollars and resiliency dollars as well. This is really what we do in government relations too. We really are out there trying to influence a lot of our state agencies, our mayors, our governors, to make those top-down decisions so that our hard-earned taxpayer dollars can be put towards next generation infrastructure. So if you're interested, or folks who are interested are thinking about how to follow this money, I have just put a couple of recommendations here. Grant writing is going to be really, really important. A lot of municipalities have in-house grant writers, some don't. Just using a wastewater example, some entities are hiring outside grant writers, but having a grant writer can be really helpful in securing some of these dollars. Okay, and then I'm going to just skip ahead. I heard there's a lot of wastewater folks in the audience. So I'm going to just quickly mention the state revolving fund. So the majority of the $55 billion of water is going towards the state revolving fund. And the state revolving fund is a loan payback program that I mentioned the water departments, they have authority over, and they really look into this fund and then they dole out this money for whatever municipalities might need it. So if you hear state revolving fund or you hear about SRFs, that's where that $55 billion in water is going here. This is just another complicated way of showing you how it's going, but we understand that water conservation, water treatment systems, and you can see I've listed some of the energy efficiency needs. These are all applicable in this new funding. So this is a really, really broad and really flexible source of water funding here. We're super excited about that. So I think I'm just going to wrap up there and see if there are any questions. We really are proud and excited to capitalize and operationalize on these dollars, and we're very hopeful that in all of the different infrastructure industries that you're involved in, that you can start seeing a lot of great projects being bid out and some upgrades. So if there are any questions, otherwise, thank you.